When American colonists declared their independence, they knew they'd have to fight to hold their ground. In 1775, at Lexington and Concord, New England Minutemen fired the first shots in defense of freedom, setting the standard for proud ranks of soldiers who followed. Hello and welcome to part one of the Villages Media Group's Faces of Freedom. I'm Larry L., coming to you from Camp Blanding, Florida, one of the U.S. Army's training bases and our backdrop for the final chapter in our Faces of Freedom series, America's Frontline Heroes. And at the front line is where courage and resolve transform ordinary men into heroes, characteristics displayed and tested throughout America's conflicts. As the tip of the spear, soldiers endure conditions that would wither most men's nerve, like those faced by the forces at the Chosin Reservoir in the Korean War. Battle conditions included a relentless Chinese army, 30 below temperatures, and 50-mile-per-hour winds. Marine Corporal Bill Podvin almost lost his life at Chosin, and as Stephen Reynolds reports, he almost lost something nearly as dear.
Pictures. Precious, irreplaceable, especially for soldiers fighting in faraway places, the one constant connection to loved ones left behind.
I never thought I'd see that picture again, because that was the only picture he had with him, of course.
In 1950, Bill Podvin headed off to war again. During World War II, he had served aboard the USS Putnam. When he returned home to Duluth, he married Audrey and had the first of two sons, Howard.
They were poor, needed money and clothes, so he heard about this neat thing called the Marine Corps Reserve.
Bill got what he needed to support his new family, but then had to leave them to join the 4th Infantry Battalion, Company B, and the Korean conflict. The one personal effect he brought along was a wallet-sized picture of young Howie.
I kind of researched a lot of this just recently because Dad never talked about it.
It's understandable why one might not wish to recall a place like the Chosin Reservoir, or as the soldiers who fought there referred to it, the frozen Chosin.
And there was 120,000 Chinese shooting at him from up on the ridge on this, in this valley they were in. So they were just like sitting ducks.
Corporal Podvin was one of those sitting ducks. On the day he was shot, the enemy left him for dead.
Apparently the Chinese came in and raffled through his bag and found a picture of me and tore it up.
Unlike that photo, Howard's dad made it back to Duluth in one piece. And then a few months later, at this dinner party to honor the brave men of Company B, fellow Marine Vernon Deardahl gave Bill something much more meaningful than any medal.
So it was in 3 pieces, and so that was how Bill got it back in 3 pieces. And I just scotch taped it together and saved it.
Father and son had made it home.
To get something back from that war, from that battle where he got shot is amazing.
In the same way that precious picture was restored, Howard has pieced together the story of his father's unspoken heroism, and it's done this son proud. What do you want people to know about your father?
He was a good guy.
Bill Podvin passed away in 1998 after he moved to the Villages. He was instrumental in starting American Legion Post 347 in Lady Lake and was the 3rd commander of that post. In its blitz across Europe, the German army proved how devastating a weapon the tank could be. So Allied forces needed a platform to defeat the heavy Nazi armor, a job for which the M10 destroyer was well suited. Its armor-piercing shells could wipe out a tank from 1,000 yards. Private Larry Mangini drove an M10 and was part of a force that knocked out 2,600 German tanks, including 300 at the Battle of the Bulge. As Kevin Coffin reports, Mangini's memories of victory are mixed with those of agony.
Speed and firepower were key to Larry Mangini's survival in World War II. His M10 tank killer was lethal to the enemy, even though it didn't offer him much protection.
It's totally different than a normal Sherman tank kind of a thing because it has hardly no armor and it can cruise at about 35 miles an hour. So their motto was to seek, strike, and destroy, to get in there as fast as you can and then get out.
A strategy that served him well, as he and his crew won many encounters and battles across Europe, until they reached Buchenwald, where the atrocities of the German concentration camps stopped them in their tracks.
The Germans had taken off because we pushed them out, and they left behind a whole bunch of bodies that were like skeletons that they had starved and tortured. And well, anyhow, we had them bury them nearby in a cemetery for a time being.
Mangini would later participate in another devastating confrontation at the Battle of the Bulge.
We were knee-deep in 2 feet of snow in Belgium at that time, and that's when the Germans came up with a white flag to surrender, and General McAuliffe answered him by saying, "Nuts." The Germans wanted him to surrender, and he turned around and told them, "Nuts, he's not going to surrender."
So for the next 2 weeks, Mangini and U.S. forces would battle the Germans in one of the war's bloodiest battles. For Mangini, those 2 weeks are times he would just as soon forget.
It's nothing that I read about, I witnessed it, so I can attest to that, all right. I've never talked about this to anybody. It's history and it's over and done with, and thank goodness for that.
Mangini maintained a close relationship with his crew after the war, keeping in close contact with them all. He calls them his brothers for life. Still to come, healing the wounded along the front lines in Vietnam, the story of Peggy Duval. But first, as we head to break, here's another frontline hero.
I am Major Daniel Levinson, an Army infantry commander in World War II. I was wounded during the Battle of the Bulge, awarded the Purple Heart, Silver Star, and 2 Bronze Stars.
Welcome back to Faces of Freedom, America's Frontline Heroes. We are at Camp Blanding, Florida, looking at ambush training for active duty and reserve soldiers, just one of the many exercises conducted here. As we continue, the village's media groups look at the men and women who met the enemy face to face and stood tall in the name of freedom. A black granite wall in Washington, D.C. lists the more than 58,000 Americans killed in Vietnam. But for every name on that memorial, there were more than 2 who survived their injuries because of frontline medics. One of those medical heroes was nurse Peggy Duval. Christine Eschenfelder has her story.
Thousands of American military women served in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Most were nurses, like Peggy Duval.
We worked 7 to 7, 7 in the morning to 7 at night, or 7 at night to 7 in the morning. And you were assigned 6 days a week. Many times we worked 7 days. If there were casualties, you just had to go in. You know, they'd call you in on your day off. But to be honest with you, I was just as happy to work.
Duval treated hundreds of injured soldiers, but some stay with her even now, like one young man who was only about 19 years old.
Unfortunately, he stepped on a friendly landmine, and one of our own landmines, and he was severely injured. In fact, one arm and both legs were totally blown off, and a piece of shrapnel had come into his throat, and so he had a trachea essentially made from the shrapnel, and both his eyes were taken out. Days later, when he started to recover, all he wanted to do was talk, and of course he couldn't with his trach. So with his one good arm, he would kind of write on paper, and of course he didn't know where he was writing, you know, and had to keep moving the paper for him, you know, but all he wanted to do was talk, you know, but he had just gotten married just before he came to Vietnam. So I often wonder about him along with others.
Duval says a lot of humanitarian work was also done in Vietnam.
The doctor and the nurses, and we always had a military police escort with us, go into the villages or into the orphanages and set up little clinics to try and treat whatever we could.
During her tour, Duval went on one very joyful R&R. Her sweetheart Dan, also in the military, joined her in Hawaii.
And that's in fact where we got engaged. He brought an engagement ring with him. And he asked me to marry him, and I said yes. Of course, the impulsive person that he is, he wanted to get married like the next day. And I said, well, thanks, but no thanks. I had to go back to Vietnam. I had 4 more months to do there.
The couple married when she returned home. Duval says she encourages young people to serve in the military, especially women.
Wonderful opportunity, not only career. I was a young nurse. I had a lot to learn as a new graduate, but the military was probably the best place to learn it.
The Vietnam Women's Memorial was dedicated on the National Mall, yards from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, on November 11, 1993. Air superiority was America's key strategic advantage in Vietnam, from moving troops by helicopter to supporting them with planes. Firepower from above was crucial, and few aircraft could rain down fire better than the AC-130. The mammoth black gunship lived up to its nickname, Spectre. Its mission was to unleash destruction on the enemy. And as Jessica Kiss reports, on 111 of those missions was Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Michael Weeks.
In the air, you don't see face-to-face the blood and guts, but you're always subject to a surprise that could bring you and your crew down.
Commissioned as second lieutenant in the United States Air Force at 20 years old, Michael Weeks was already a seasoned pilot by the time duty called in Vietnam.
I flew AC-130 gunships. We were actually stationed at Ubon Air Force Base in Thailand. The Army kind of kidded us because they said we commuted to war, which in a way was right.
Weeks and 14 crew members flew combat missions an average of every 3rd day, from Thailand to Laos, Cambodia, or Vietnam.
And our main job was to interdict the trucks traveling down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In the back of your mind, you know, there are people in those trucks. I have just killed those people. I'm not ever going to see them, I'm not ever going to know their names, but I know somewhere inside of me, I'm responsible for the death of those people. And you carry it always.
Equipped with 20mm guns capable of firing 6,000 rounds a minute, the Spectre impacted both enemy and ally.
Occasionally, we would get a call from the command post in Saigon that we had our ground troops, our Army troops, were under heavy fire and possibly surrounded by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. At 6,000 rounds a minute, we could scatter the enemy pretty darn well.
Before Weeks fired a single bullet on Vietnam, he spent the first 6 years of the war flying C-141 transport jets from the U.S. to the Pacific, delivering supplies, only to pick up the dead and the wounded.
Arms missing, legs missing, half of faces missing, and probably as bad, if not worse, were minds missing. It was not unusual to go back and talk to someone and they didn't have a clue who they were or where they were, and they probably never would. And so that's where I saw the face-to-face effects of war.
Lieutenant Colonel Weeks served his country for 29 years. He retired from the Air Force in 1987. When we come back, fighting in not one war, but 2, the military career of Charles Rogers. But first, here's another hero to whom we owe our freedom.
My name is Harold Sievers. I was an airman first class in the United States Air Force. My unit was credited with shooting down 15 MiGs in 1 month in the Korean War, of which we got credit for 8 of them.
Welcome back. We continue our look at the faces who help shape a nation, the men and women of our armed services who put their lives on the line. They are America's frontline heroes. In 1940, the United States Army was still 1 year away from entering World War II, but in terms of having a ready war machine, it was light years away. The nation's tank inventory included only 28 new models and less than 1,000 older ones. But by 1942, production soared to 25,000, and by the end of the war, more than 88,000. And helping prepare America's tank operators was instructor Charles Rogers. Susan Koljasar tells us more.
Early on, Charlie Rogers was determined to show his patriotism and join the military, and nothing, not even his family, was going to stop him.
Everybody that became 18 years of age, or even 17 in the case of Navy guys and Marines, you went in the service. My father was a little perturbed because I wouldn't have had to go. We were on a farm, and at that time they were leaving one boy on each farm.
After basic training, Rogers became an instructor for tank operation and camouflage in Fort Meade, Maryland. And during World War II, he was part of the Omaha Beach invasion.
I was strictly a spectator because I was a replacement for General Patton's Armored. And the beachhead in Normandy had to be secured before Patton could get his Armored in. And then he had to lose some men before I went because I was a replacement.
Following that, he was assigned as an M8 driver with the B Troop of the 86th Recon. Then, while traveling through France, he was injured while his crew stopped at a German gasoline dump to fill up their tank.
I no sooner put 2 jerry cans up on the tank and a shell come in and landed in the field and it blew me off it. And for that little escapade, I put 7.5 months in the hospital, and that was the end of my Army career at that time.
Rogers was discharged on June 29, 1945 with 50% disability. But with no work available, he decided to re-enlist in 1949. After a few weeks as part of the 16th Recon in Korea, he became ill and was deemed unfit for combat. He ended up in the hospital and was transferred to Japan.
When I got out of the hospital, I joined the 502nd Recon Platoon, which was security for the commanding general of the 8th Army. And they had left a squad of 10 men at the general's house with his wife. So that's where I went.
During his time in the military, although there were some unpleasant experiences, Rogers says he has no regrets and he'd do it all again without question.
It teaches you discipline and I don't know, it just makes a better person of you.
Charlie Rogers is currently the commander for the Disabled American Veterans Chapter 150 in the Villages. When Faces of Freedom returns, serving God and his country in the middle of Vietnam, the role of Chaplain Ernest Banner. But first, another American frontline hero.
My name is Ray Carrazza. I was a medic in the United States Army during Vietnam. While my unit's mission was to search, find, and destroy the enemy, mine was to search, find, and heal our wounded.
Welcome back to Faces of Freedom, America's frontline heroes. Coming to you from Camp Blanding, Florida, one of the Army's elite training bases, which includes this indoor simulator where infantrymen train to experience close contact scenarios with the M16. The average age of the American soldier in Vietnam was only 19. Young men, fully grown physically, but still growing up in many other ways, leaving them especially vulnerable. And some battle scars couldn't be treated by doctors, so many leaned on the spiritual strength provided by military chaplains like Colonel Ernie Banner. Ernest Banner always knew he answered to a higher power, so when he received his calling, he chose the structure of the military for his ministry.
One of the reasons I wanted to go into the chaplaincy was to work with men.
His first assignment couldn't have been more different. At Schilling Manor in Kansas, he was the only chaplain in the waiting wives community of 700 women and 2,300 children.
Every hour was an anxious hour, and I was fortunate. I didn't have to make any death notifications to that community while I was there for 10 months, for which I'm very grateful.
However, the casualties of war couldn't be avoided once he was sent to Vietnam. Combat meant dealing with death and injury. The fallout of combat led to soldiers' problems with drugs and alcohol, crises which took an enormous emotional toll.
Well, it was very debilitating, but as a chaplain, we were considered one of the leaders, and because of that, we had to rise above our personal need and keep the soldier in mind.
As a man of conviction, Banner also kept the needs of the civilians in mind. Once, while visiting a Vietnamese school, he noticed a girl with a cleft palate being shunned by her classmates, so he helped raise money and arrange for corrective surgery. Good deeds which meant little when he returned home to a war-weary and hostile America.
A young man walked up to within about 3 feet of me and spat at me. And I walked up to him. I said, "Young man, I'm not going to do anything at this point because of what you did, but you certainly don't want to do that again."
Banner wondered if that moment of rage dishonored his faith. but he never wavered in his decision to follow that faith into harm's way.
If people are in circumstances that need ministry, well then that's where the minister and the priest and the rabbi should be.
After moving across the globe from Vietnam to Alaska to Korea to Germany, Banner says the real hero in his family is his wife for never wavering in her support. Straight ahead, the Battle of Okinawa and the remarkable story of Corporal Joe Reich when Frontline Heroes returns. But first, the face of another true American hero.
My name is Jerry Corr. As an airman second class in the United States Air Force, I served in Libya during the first crisis in Beirut, Lebanon. My unit's mission in Spain was to protect the B-47 Stratojets loaded with atomic bombs.
Welcome back to Faces of Freedom, America's Frontline Heroes. I'm Larry L. We are here at Camp Blanding, where active duty and reserve soldiers train in almost every aspect of combat, including water landings via the helicopter. Those types of water landings weren't around during World War II, as many soldiers and Marines had to storm ashore in amphibious landing craft like in Okinawa. The 3-month campaign proved to be the bloodiest battle in the Pacific Theater, claiming over 200,000 lives. And as Rebecca Underwood tells us, Army Corporal Joe Reich was nearly included in those statistics on several occasions.
The battle for Okinawa took a terrible toll on American troops, so more soldiers were sent to the island to replace those who had been killed or wounded. Joe Reich was one of those men.
I was there about 2 days and was sent up to the front lines.
Reich battled his way across the island for a couple of weeks until a firefight nearly took his life.
I went up into that foxhole and I crawled in on my belly. And when I was down in there and I straightened myself up, then all of a sudden the lights went out and I saw all kind of colors and I couldn't imagine what happened.
After regaining consciousness, Reich realized he had been shot. His sergeant told him to crawl out of the foxhole, down the hill, and to someone working first aid.
So I took off my helmet and set it on my knee, and I saw a hole about that big in the side of the helmet. Right away I could picture these things you see on television of operating on somebody's head and their brain, and all these thoughts run through your mind. And I turned the helmet around, and there was another hole on the other side of the helmet. So the bullet had gone into the helmet liner, across the top of my head, and out the other side.
Reich was medicated and woke up the next day in the first aid station. A doctor came to his bed and put a check on his chart, meaning he would be transferred to a hospital in Guam to recover.
Everybody was telling me, oh, you got that $1 million wound. You got the wound that's going to send you back stateside. And I said, well, that was $1 million wound. The government must have kept all of it because I never saw any of it.
This wasn't Reich's only close call. His first day on the island, he was fired upon while in his foxhole. He says if it wasn't for a pile of dirt in front of him, he would have taken a bullet to the chest.
I'm just glad that the good Lord spared me, that I'm here today to talk about it.
When Reich was in the hospital recovering from his head wound, the War Department sent a telegram to his parents notifying them of the serious injury. Luckily, Reich sent a letter before the telegram, softening the blow by telling them he would be all right and would recover. Stay with us. When we come back, we'll preview Part 2 of the Villages Media Group presentation, Faces of Freedom, America's Frontline Heroes. As we head to break, let's meet more of America's defenders.
My name is Dottie White. I was a captain and critical care RN in the United States Army during Vietnam. I worked 14-hour days in the burn unit, treating hundreds of soldiers.
I'm Donald Walter. I earned the Bronze Star as a private in the Army during World War II, as my unit battled all across Europe and finally into Germany.
Over 1 million Americans have made the ultimate sacrifice for their country, giving their lives in the name of freedom. But even more have made smaller, no less important sacrifices to preserve America's ideals. Just ahead in Part 2 of Frontline Heroes, we'll introduce you to more profiles in courage. Like Command Sergeant Major Don Edwards, who was wounded by Chinese soldiers near the Yellow River in the Korean War and made a heroic trek back to safety. And Frank Cook, who served as platoon leader in Vietnam and later found himself in the Pentagon on 9/11 as a hijacked airliner crashed into the building. We'll also meet Sergeant Larry Lederman, who was part of the historic landing force that stormed Omaha Beach on D-Day. These stories and many more in the Villages Media Group's presentation of Faces of Freedom, America's Frontline Heroes. I'm Larry L. We'll see you then.
Faces of Freedom, America's Frontline Heroes, was presented by the Villages Media Group in partnership with Properties of the Villages and Comcast.